So firstly, guys, thank you everyone. I mean, what a roller coaster of different things we've been through. I mean, I've learned so much in so little time. I did see quite strong chat about kind of conservative drug policy and so on and so forth, and I just thought I should address that because someone asked me to, and that's completely fair enough. I've had similar thoughts in the past and did quite a lot of research into the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. And actually they were born out of complete horror at the prison system as it is, the abuse of drug policy and the endemic racism that went alongside it. And I think, as Ishmael's been saying, it's incredibly important that this is not an us against them sort of battle. This is a can we get everyone on side to support something and make very real change, and change as soon as we possibly can while still being sort of safe and fair to all. And I think also the other point to mention that is crucial is we also invited Labour and their drug policy reform group to join us today, because we thought that would be great to have everyone here, but unfortunately they weren't able to make it. So hopefully next time it would be great, because actually the Lib Dems have a party, a reform group, so the Conservatives, so do Labour, and that would be fantastic to have them all chatting together and see where they connect and see maybe where they don't. But that was all I wanted to add. So I'll hand you back over to Nadia to run the rest of the Q&A and all these fabulous questions that we've been getting.
Maybe I could say something about that, just since I was like kind of on a roll, and then I'll pause, and I'd be curious about Timothy.
Yeah, please go for it. I also think Nadia might have frozen, so that would
perfect. So I'll just kill time until she unfreezes. I just want to say that, like, just for people to have some context. So I was raised Muslim and still identify as Muslim. I was politically socialized or radicalized, you might say, as an American following 9/11. And following, like, seeing the kind of dissolving of civil liberties and the way that the kind of left and the right in the United States, you know, merged to create this like political party in favor of endless war. So I just want to appreciate the concerns that people have about engaging with conservative political kind of worlds. I think that there's a tendency of people in the global north to see within this narrow, like, how is their domestic policy affecting us? And, you know, in the US, like, the Democrats and the Republicans are essentially identical with foreign policy. So we're like, well, they're going to keep bombing people who I'm related to anyway. So I do want to acknowledge that there's a very real aspect of these like questions and concerns. And I think that there is a really important need for people who are doing progressive drug policy to not just engage with this multi-partisan aspect like we're talking about, but as many people in the chat have said, like, actually hold clear boundaries and standards and stabilized kind of perspective about what it is that we're actually fighting for. One of the big lessons from the cannabis industry is that you don't fight for reforms you're going to have to undo later. And it's really hard to know what the future is going to be like. So I do think that, to Timothy's first point, like, going slow and steady, as much as I really, truly, deeply understand the urgency of need of these substances and availability for mental health and for spiritual use, the time that we spend to set the groundwork will be well spent. It will be worth it when we have something that's a better structure in the long run. So kind of a general response, but.
Yeah, sorry, I was just having some technical difficulties, but I'm back now. But yeah, Ishmael, you hit all the right spots. I think everyone sort of said the same thing, that this slow and steady approach is what we need. You can't rush into anything. We can't minimize or sort of say that the risks aren't big, because they are big if we do take this too quickly. And one of the other things that's come up in a couple of the questions is sort of limits on accessibility and how we can stop that from happening. So how can we, this is a question to everyone really, so how can we ensure that the medicines, these medicines, are available for the public, for those that really need them, and how can we ensure that they don't become a luxury just for the rich? So if anyone wants to answer first, go ahead.
Maybe the Dutch example is a nice one, because I also saw a question about this. in the smart shops you can buy the mycelium and the spores of mushrooms, and you can easily grow them yourselves. So a growing kit only will cost you like 20 euros, so it's very affordable. The question was, is this legal? Yes, the mycelium is legal, but when it starts to turn into mushrooms, then it suddenly becomes illegal. But I think this could be a nice way to hold it available for also people of lower social background.
Yeah, I wanted to just go back to the previous thing and then I'll answer that. I just want to say thank you, Anna, for making that point and pointing out about the CDPRG, and wanted to reiterate that, you know, as I mentioned, the C in our name is it's strategic. We aren't really party affiliated. This is our target audience. This is who we're addressing in our arguments and presenting the evidence and that kind of thing. And of course, the evidence that we're trying to present to the right people is so that research can be facilitated, costs of trials can be brought down, and you know, that would mean that there's going to be more evidence on more indications. I know this is all within a sort of medical paradigm, but then hopefully so that these treatments to begin with would find their way into the NHS. You know, if the costs come down of doing the trials, it means the costs come down of giving the treatment, which means it's more likely to be recommended by NICE to be taken up by the NHS and therefore have wider access.
Yeah, I guess I can chime in here. Sorry, I'm moving screens around here. I'm realizing my camera's off, but yeah, a few thoughts on this one. I guess, I mean, one question I have about access, and I completely agree with the point that, you know, people who want to grow mushrooms should be able to, and you know, there should be access there. I think big question I have though is back to the kind of getting your grandmother over that barrier here, your Gen X parents over that barrier is, you know, this question of what population are we thinking about? Are we largely advancing this for people who are already really into psychedelics and, you know, love this topic and enthusiasts, and bringing down barriers for them to get access? Because that's a really small sliver. Oh, sorry, I keep hitting my mic here. I'm going to hold it up. So that's a very small sliver. I mean, if you just look at the stats on LSD users, for example, that's, to Ishmael's point, I mean, you know, the data is murky because it's in the underground, but nonetheless, I mean, it's a very small portion of the population. So I think the question is, do we want to, you know, for that small sliver of kind of all of us who are like-minded and agree on a lot of the same things on this topic, do we want to bring down barriers for them, or do we want to have, you know, wider access and really educate people at a larger scale who may be naive to the topic or may even be scared of it, and get them comfortable with that? I think, you know, those are two fundamentally different paths, and I think, you know, the strategies we use may be different depending on what the target is. My view is, you know, I think these open up a window to a lot of people that we, you know, a lot of us haven't explored, and really realign our values or bring us back to our roots. And they always say it's the people who are most scared to use psychedelics who are the ones who probably need them the most. So I do think, you know, going back to the medicalized point, I just can't help but wonder if, you know, and it's not just around the data and pointing to Roland Griffith studies and Matthew Johnson studies. I get that there's been a big push around that, but I do think there's a lot of value to just kind of that, you know, the eye-catching nature of it, to say this is FDA approved. You know, just being able to say that to someone, that this is, you know, this is FDA approved, this has gone through rigorous clinical trials, rather than saying, look at this Roland Griffith, you know, 20-page study, or look at this, you know, Stephen Ross study. Just the complexity of getting someone over the hump on that, it's a lot tougher. So I think what we've learned in politics is people respond to simple arguments, not complex scientific ones. And I think, again, you know, saying this is FDA approved, you know, can be a nice way to break through some of those barriers. Last point I'll just make on affordability, and this is something more specific to the US, but also is that prospect of making these reimbursable treatments. I think if you go, you know, even the way cannabis went in, to Ishmael's point on cannabis, it's very true when a medicalized path, but that was much more, you kind of get your cannabis card, you know, it was, you know, dubious as to how people were diagnosed. You know, what I was arguing for in psychedelic, you know, cannabis, except for Epidiolex and some other things being advanced now, I mean, really didn't go down a clinical trial path where there's a lot of protocol, there's REMS and everything around diagnosis and controls and procedures there. So, the idea I'm getting at is just, that's not a reimbursable domain, even with kind of medicalized cannabis. Medicalized psychedelics could look very different, where there's CPT codes around this, insurers recognize it and pay for it. So just another thing to keep in mind with that more medicalized route. And then last thing I'll point out just on bringing down the cost of these is, I know this is a bit of a hackneyed phrase and not perfect, but I'll invoke it nonetheless, as the free market as an engine of innovation. I think there's been a lot of groupthink in psychedelics of there have to be these large macrodose experiences. You have to have 1 to 2 clinicians in the room. That gets incredibly expensive. There's interesting novel approaches that I see emerging in the commercial sector of new ways to address this, kind of new formats to monitor patients. One, for example, that Ellucis is advancing is more of a control room approach, where the patient's in the room, there's a camera or some monitoring system, but someone isn't actively there watching them all the time. And admittedly, from my own experiences, I don't always want someone watching me anyway, and you kind of have more of an overseer. And then if someone has to hit the safety button or is having a bad trip, they can hit that, or there's biometric linking or whatever, and then someone comes in and aids the patient. But that can significantly bring down the cost. If you have 1 clinician and 5 to 6 patients all getting a drug at one time, that could be another way to bring down costs here. So just a few kind of random tangential thoughts. I'll stop talking now.
Can I just quickly jump onto that? That's a really good point. And that's also a helpful distinction between US medical policy and medical policy in other parts of the world. We're behind, right? Like the US is still dealing with payment for treatment model. And one of the interesting things that's different about FDA and EMA is that EMA only approves drugs that it can also show are cost effective because the cost is on the state. Whereas in the US, the cost is on private insurers. So right now we have kind of like this shitty bargain where like the only way we can get coverage in the US is going through these insurance systems, but fight for Medicare for all, or at least some sort of universal healthcare system, because that would solve a lot of the access problems from the medicalized perspective. I agree. It wouldn't for other things, but like it is true that because medical marijuana isn't going through FDA in the same, or it is, but in a more complicated way, that because psychedelics are, there could be reimbursements that there aren't available for cannabis, at least for now.
I think that's really interesting. Timothy, I can see you're wanting to reply. Am I right?
Yeah, just to something that Tim said about the sort of, and Ishmael's mentioned it as well, this sort of like simple arguments and then data not necessarily being the thing, these big scientific papers and things like that. It's one of the things that I think is so great about this particular conference is the patient perspectives panel. I think that these things are hugely important, and it's often those kind of things that will get hearts and minds moved in line with the evidence. You hear a story and then you're like, oh wow, is that just true of this one person? Oh no, there's loads of people. And it makes me think of Theracil in Canada and their compassionate access campaign. And we're hoping to sort of do a similar campaign here in the UK, thinking, if we can show that individuals need access now, we might be able to sort of sidestep some of the market authorization process in order to allow access, but also to drive the political point home in the public consciousness as well, really put pressure on so that we can see the rescheduling happen, so that then it becomes this tumble forward of a reassessment. Just
lovely. Thank you guys all for that. So I've got just touching on the medicalization of the psychedelics. So obviously from the US and the UK, that's kind of the forefront of how we see legalization occurring. But just a question to Tom. So obviously in the Netherlands, it's entirely different. It's not really medicalized at all, psychedelics. So how do Dutch people feel about medical psychedelics? So do they really want doctors to use them medically, and are there any barriers there?
Good question. I have to think a little bit about that. In the Netherlands, we do have clinical trials with psychedelics, mainly psilocybin, but also small-scale LSD microdosing. And what I see in our harm reduction group is that these projects are often used to rationalize people's own drug use. So they say, oh, I'm taking psychedelics and this research says it's great, so I'm doing nothing wrong. But actually, I think these are two separate circuits. So although I said that the spiritual experience is useful by itself and it can relieve stress and therefore it can help you with also medical things. But the real medical disorders like PTSD or maybe depression, there's something else. And there is a circuit of people who try to cure their own depression when using psychedelics, but I think that's a real risk. So I try to prevent those experiences from happening. I think it should be under medical supervision.
Amazing, thank you for that. And we've got a specific question for Tim. So we've had quite a few similar kind of questions. So asking how people from the UK or just all around really can invest in individual US and Canadian psychedelic startups, and just any general advice for new investors in the sphere.
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's a totally separate topic. I didn't even hit on it. There's so many ways you can take this conversation, but that was another big impetus to get into this field. As an investor and a capital allocator was what I saw as a problem. And there's a lot of, I'm not going to name names, but there's plenty of sketchy, scammy companies going public on Canadian stock exchanges, and it's literal scams. I mean, there's literal pump and dumps a la, ICOs and everything that we've seen, and even what we saw in cannabis. And there's certainly bad actors from cannabis trying to get into psychedelics now. Again, not going to name names. That are actively promoting these pump and dumps. So I would advise tread with caution. I'd almost rather buy GameStop at this point than some psychedelic stocks. Let's put it that way, or AMC or Nokia. But yeah, I would advise tread with caution in public markets. I think when you look at valuations on these companies, they're incredibly, a lot are overvalued relative to the commercial potential, especially given the, understandably limited IP around a lot of these strategies. And I think there's a lot of hype. And so as it applies to, investing in public companies, do your homework and tread lightly is all I'd say. I don't want to have that holier than thou attitude of, that I think hedge funds had towards Wall Street bettors of, oh, this is a game for the grownups. Don't be a retail investor. But I'd say there's a lot of companies out there, and for many that bubble's going to pop. There's certainly some real ones, don't get me wrong, but I will say this. I think if you have to list on a Canadian stock exchange, if you can't list on the NASDAQ, there's a reason for that. If you can't find a strong enough investor base and also an investor base of life sciences validating investors, there's a really good reason for that. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. So the end of the market I'm in is more private investing. We do private investment rounds. I like that and more. I think the valuations are a lot more attractive. We're kind of seeing, valuations in the range of $20 to $40 million rather than hundreds of millions or even billions if you look at MindMed or Compass Pathways. But yeah, admittedly, it's tough for people, retail investors to get in at that. I mean, there's minimum capital requirements and everything. And from an access standpoint, I think for people to financially benefit from these, that's certainly a problem. And I'd love to see platforms like AngelList or Republic maybe emerge to fund some of these where there's more crowdsourcing platforms. But for the time being, I'd say tread lightly in public markets. On the private side, a lot of it comes down to kind of networking, and meeting with entrepreneurs and getting in on these rounds early. And usually the earlier you get in, usually there's less kind of minimum capital requirements, and it's easier to squeeze in on that. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful to kind of tee things up for people for what investing may look like in this ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a lot of people appreciate that and having your opinion, hearing your opinion on it all. So next we've got a question specifically for Timmy. So I'll just read the question. So it says that structural racism, which underlies current drug laws, can't be underestimated, as people of colour are disproportionately targeted. How does the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group seek to address this? Quite a difficult one.
Yeah, I will say something about psychedelics and then I'll move it over to cannabis, because during my research into psilocybin in the UK, one of the things I've looked at is the sort of prevalence of arrests and things like this that have occurred in the past 5 years. And it accounts to something like 0.04% of all, crime reports filled out mention anything to do with magic mushrooms or psilocybin. And we can probably say the same thing is going to be true of LSD and DMT, very, very low numbers. So this is certainly something that, is close to a lot of our hearts and that we think about a lot. And one of our main projects is called the UK Review of Cannabis. So it's about looking at the barriers to access that still remain, even though cannabis can now be prescribed in the UK. And, what we're trying to do is try and decrease the black market and increase legitimate routes of access for patients, but also, ideally for an adult recreational use market. So while we don't have anything that's looking specifically at racial discrimination, this is our angle and our way of addressing these kind of issues, thinking about drug policy reform as a whole and how that impacts everybody.
Wonderful, thank you for that, Timmy. And I'll just ask the last question. So this is really to everyone. So it's, what's the best way to get trained for psychedelic psychotherapy? And just generally, how did you get into this field and to get where you are now?
Join Cosmic Care or Psycare. You already said it, Timothy, and I completely agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I intend to become a clinician. I'm training as a psychoanalyst. I'm sitting on trials, things like this, and I kind of had that in mind from the beginning. After a particularly sort of revolutionary mystico-religious experience that I had in my teens, and so I think that once you've got it in mind that you want to be a clinician, you just got to start studying. You got to read all the books that you can come across, about religious and spiritual pluralism. You got to think about, for me, psychoanalysis and how people can step back and think about the problem of suggestion and transference and all these ethical issues that come up specifically within the psychedelic psychotherapy space. And then just, if you want to do research, go down a research route. If not, choose from the beginning to think about numerous different types of psychotherapy that psychedelics will become adjuncts to. Because this is about, for me, my understanding of it is not that the psychedelic should drive the treatment. It should be the treatment is facilitated by the assistance of a psychedelic. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
I can say something quick about. Oh, sorry, go for it, Tom.
Well, I was trying to refer to your organization, actually. I saw on Maps there's a manual for psychedelic support. So if you are interested in this topic, check it out. So that was the end.
Yeah, we'll be, our Zendo harm reduction training will be much more broadly available starting later this year. We're pivoting like everyone else is to the internet. And like going to have more materials available that I think would be a good place to start just on a personal level. But I just want to say that a lot of people who have really powerful psychedelic experiences get super excited, and then they want to put their attention into making psychedelics more available. Friendly reminder, the world is much bigger than psychedelics, and as a lot of people have very astutely pointed out in the chat, the world needs to be a better place for psychedelic experiences to be even better. So I actually think it's a mistake to think that once you've gotten the call, you have to apply all your energy towards psychedelics. Like, actually apply that energy to like literally any other field that you're in, because as Tim Leary said, we all carry a piece of the puzzle. And I actually do believe that we're moving toward a world in which these things are going to be increasingly relevant in a lot of different sectors. If you look at like cannabis, for example, cannabis is not just about the plant and drug policy. Cannabis, once it became legal, it's an issue with regulatory, housing, it's like zoning. There's like all of these different cultural and social issues that actually are impacted by drug policy changing. And I think that's still going to be the case. So I would actually, and this isn't a direct response to any of the people in the chat, because I know there's people who have specific interests and want to be therapists and so on, and we need more healers. So please, for the love of God, do it. And like, you know, you can apply this energy to a lot of different places. And I think that it's actually needed in every sector. And I think even if it were true that the psychedelic sector had all the cool, loving, progressive people, which it doesn't, but even if that were true, I would say like, no, spread this out. We actually need to make sure that we're kind of everywhere. And that's also a helpful kind of segue into this other thing that came up around like psychedelics being morally positive or something. I'm like, you know, there's aspects and there's psychospiritual and deep spiritual aspects that I'm really willing to go in there with you on. And I think it's a mistake to assume anything about their moral status, because they're used to in a lot of different ways and have been used in a lot of different ways throughout history. So it's important to remember that the psychedelics themselves are morally neutral. Making them more available does not make the world a better place. You still got to have all that rest of the guardrails, all the rest of the ethics, all the rest of the justice. Still got to come with it.
Yeah, I guess all really good points, by the way, Ishmael. I'll chime in just quickly. I guess I have less to speak about personally, kind of on becoming a therapist. I guess I went to the dark side here, but I will say, you know, I think one big thing, there's a big push, you know, for people to become therapists, and I see a lot of resources dedicated to that. I think the way a lot of people can do the most good is kind of look at your skill set. I mean, if you are, you know, in the right position to become a therapist and kind of have the right credentials, and or you know, you feel that's your calling, of course, that's really important, but that doesn't need to be the only path to go. I mean, when I, you know, we'll just go full kimono here, you know, had some very profound experiences with these. There was that question of, you know, what do I do with that? I want to get involved. I want to help out in what I think is the best way possible. And, you know, given my background in healthcare, I thought, you know, the best way was being a capital allocator. And on the, you know, emerging commercial side, as I spoke to seeing bad actors emerge, I thought it made a lot of sense to be someone, you know, picking the ethical actors. But moving, so I think, you know, that's to say where your skill sets are best suited, there's a whole range of ways people can plug into this ecosystem. And if you have a pharmacology background, you can make a great researcher or scientific advisor. I mean, there's a whole host of ways people can plug in. So give that some thought. On the therapist side, though, I will say, and this certainly has implications in the commercial sphere, there's a huge supply-demand imbalance for therapists. There are way more people who want these therapies than those who can deliver them. And that's creating a huge bottleneck. And I think more resources should be pushed that way. And I kind of analogize to nurses as well. You know, I think therapists should be paid well as well to do this. And this should be something you can make a living off of. When there is a supply-demand imbalance like that, I think it can be something that, you know, it can fully support people. We certainly saw that in just kind of nurses in general in that marketplace. You know, again, a supply-demand imbalance and people getting paid much better now and a lot more benefits. So that would be my only comment. Certainly fully support that. I think there's a lot of ways people can help.